Souls franchise is known for being incredibly difficult, and it's a series that I personally love, and now the time has come to rank them on a tier list from best to worst, based on how good they are for beginners. So let's dive right in. But just before we get into it, I would like to ask that you consider hitting that subscribe button and turn on notifications, as it's free and it really helps me out, and you can always change your mind later. And now, without further ado, let's talk about it, starting with Dark Souls 1. The first Dark Souls game has always been a strong candidate for the best Souls game for beginners, and I do agree that it does an incredible job at teaching the core mechanics that follow through the entire series, such as using iframes to dodge roll effectively, backstabs, parries, Estus management, and of course, exploration.
Are you serious right now, bro?
But before we get too far into this, I feel like I should quickly explain what factors I'm going to look at to rank each game. So how I'm going to judge these games is based on the following criteria: the teaching of the mechanics, the first boss, how accessible it is to newcomers, how accessible it makes the other titles, and of course, how enjoyable the game actually is. And then using those factors, I'm going to rank it in a tier list. So now we know how these games will be judged. So let's discuss how Dark Souls 1 teaches the mechanics to the player. DS1 did a really good job with its starting area, as it teaches you the fundamentals of all the games in the franchise. You were taught that danger was around every corner, and you were also taught to explore all possible options that an area could possibly present to you, because it will always reward you, and sometimes even make things easier for you. The first area ends and starts with the Asylum Demon. When you first exit the jail cell and you reach the top of the ladder, then you will be at the entrance to the exit of the asylum, and after you spend multiple seconds opening the door, then bam, there it is, the first boss of the series. Well, not exactly the first, but don't worry, I'm coming back to this. After running out the side door in the arena, you get your gear and your Estus flask, and after exploring the top level of the asylum, you're able to perform the first advanced maneuver, plunge attacks. These very subtle tutorials create the sense of no hand-holding, and then it's up to the player to overcome the learning curves, and I love that. These games are very well known for this, but it isn't really done to this standard in the other games. The Asylum Demon himself isn't exactly the hardest boss, but it can cause some issues for those who aren't used to the stop, think, then hit mentality that these games. Personally, for me, Dark Souls 1's a bit slow, but it makes it feel more purposeful. Each attack needs to be planned, inputted, and then the player needs to wait for it to register, whereas with most other action games, it's very forgiving, which isn't really that satisfying to me. But the demon does work as a strong introduction to the flow of the combat, and does present a fair and balanced but still challenging barrier to entry. As for its accessibility to newcomers, it's very easy to just plug and play with it. The game itself doesn't have too many stats or classes compared to the later titles. Yes, I am looking at you, Elden. Why is there so many? So it isn't too hard to just play how you want. However, and this is a big however, there is the issue that the stat investments are definitive, as there is no way to respec, which in my opinion does drag down the game a tiny bit for me in terms of newcomer accessibility, but it isn't too damaging to the overall experience as long as you know what you're doing. Dark Souls 1 to this day is still incredibly enjoyable. It has some of the best boss fights, areas, and storylines. There is so much to this world, and I love how discreetly it's fed to the player through the environment and the item descriptions, and hell, even the boss's design reflects their lore. DS1 is amazing, but I do have to say the game does fall short after the infamous Ornstein and Smough fight, because the late game is honestly god-awful. Like, it sucks a lot. But my other issues with Dark Souls is that it doesn't make the later titles accessible at all, due to how slow and honestly clunky the game is. So with all this in mind, it pains me to admit that I'm going to have to put this one in mid. And now it's time for the game in the series that everybody hates, Dark Souls 2. When I began writing this segment, I did really try to go in with a non-biased view of the game, and I did really want to enjoy it because I've heard so many great things, but I just can't. There is no clear first level of this game but the place you spawn. Things betwixt is pretty much just a few basic enemies and the Firekeeper's house. But now let's look at the next criteria, the first boss. This is quite a tricky section to talk about, simply because you can play the areas in any order you want, with them just being harder. So it's similar to Dark Souls 1 in that sense with the divulging paths, but it makes it hard to say what the first actual boss should be. But the way I play this game, I'm gonna say it's the Last Giant, which I mean, it's okay, but it's nothing compared to other first bosses in the franchise. The Forest of Fallen Giants is a pretty decent area, but it does show very early on the major issue with this game. That is, of course, Skull of the First Sin's enemy overpopulation issue. Basically, Dark Souls 2 was released twice, and one of the fixes in the most recent version was that they just put a bunch of enemies in an area to make the game artificially harder for the player. But honestly, it gets too much in the way of the enjoyment the game has. Like, it's not a bad game at all, it's just it has the most prevalent issues out of all of them. One of the biggest issues I have with this game is the amount of iframes a roll has is locked behind a stat, and I think that that was a really poor choice. That mixed with the game locking some of your health unless you reverse hollow is incredibly frustrating, because it relies relies on items to gain it back. And I feel like they just tried to clone what Demon's Souls did, which I don't have an issue with, but it's just executed so poorly that I can't help but be annoyed by it. But something I really do like about this game is that it begins to increase the speed, and it makes the combat feel just a tiny bit more refined, and that does make the later titles more accessible, which is very nice. Don't get me wrong, this game does get good in the mid to late game and the DLC, but just in terms of the game as a whole, I'm gonna have to be critical in this, so I'm putting it in terrible. As with all these, please do feel free to argue your side in the comments though. Now let's move on to the next title. Now logically it should be Dark Souls 3, but no, don't think you know what I'm gonna say. This is my video, and I'm a wild card, baby, because we're gonna talk about Demon's Souls. No, not that one. Yes, that's one. Demon's Souls was the very first game in the Souls lineup, and it had one of the most intriguing ideas for the tutorial. After creating your character, the game dropped you into an area that contained enemies that weren't too difficult, but instead varied in type, which is immediately promising. After fighting your way through this little stretch of the level, you are immediately introduced to the Archstones, which warp you to different parts of a level, or a completely separate level if you're in the Nexus. After using the Archstone, you're immediately taken off to a new part of the area, with a few more enemies and a boss. This is where you're going to notice a lot of similarities between Demon's Souls and the other games, because you are supposed to die here, but you can't actually kill this boss, and if you do, you're forced into a new area where you will die in a cutscene, because isn't that just a great reward for beating such a difficult boss? After you die, you're whisked away to the main hub. This is the Nexus, and what I like about this game is how quickly you're introduced to the core mechanics and gameplay loop. You go out and explore, kill some stuff, use the Archstones to teleport back to the Nexus, and then spend your souls on whatever you want, and then do it all again. It's quick, it's clean, and it's very fun. The remaster of this game for the PS5 also feels a lot faster in terms of rolling and general combat, which I do enjoy, and so the game gets a seal of approval for making the later games more accessible, but also making itself accessible to first-timers. The only issue I have with this game is the lack of checks. The Archstones are the only checkpoints in the levels, and it does get really frustrating as most of the time it feels like you're making very little progress through the level until you stumble across a shortcut, which does not give the same rush as finding a bonfire, by the way. It's a very small annoyance, but I can definitely see it making new players feel that the game is very, very giving, which it technically is, but that's kind of besides the point. But as a whole, the game has a solid tutorial, lays a decent framework for the later titles, and the fact it's surrounded by an enjoyable experience puts it in mid. But do you know what else starts with mid? That's right, mid. It's Elden Ring time, baby! Okay, let's get right into it. Elden Ring has 3 first bosses I want to talk about, because they all teach different things, but they all introduce the main loop of the game. So let's start where the game drops you off. The Grafted Scion. It's honestly just a repeat of Demon's Souls yet again, because the only way to progress is to die. And if you beat him, then you get forced to die, so there wasn't really a point in beating him, was there now, FromSoft? After dying, you are going to notice a bit of a theme here, you are whisked away to the Stranded Graveyard. This is the proper tutorial for the game. As it's here, you are introduced to the main flow of combat, and it tells you the controls, which might have been nice to know before this point, but we move, and the basics you would expect from a tutorial. One thing I really like about this area is that it allows you to combine all your knowledge into the context of a boss fight. And on that note, the Soldier of Godric is a pretty basic fight, but for first timers it could possibly present a challenge, because at this point you don't have much health or stamina or, well, anything. Once you have beaten the boss and you have left the graveyard, you can now exit to the first main area of the game, Limgrave. Limgrave is absolutely massive and is incredibly beautiful, and is also very rage-inducing. This is a nice segue into our next point, because the Tree Sentinel is a major learning point for how best to tackle the challenges the game will throw at you, mainly because you'll get absolutely smashed by this thing over and over and over again, and if you haven't realized yet, newsflash, you aren't supposed to fight him yet. You are actually supposed to just run away. This is a good lesson for anyone who plays this game, because even though I've beaten these games quite a few times, it really does force you to just look around before diving headfirst at the massive horseman and get owned. Speaking of exploring, after carefully sneaking your way past that behemoth of a man through the long grass of Limgrave that was cringe, please kill me, you will find one of the first dungeons. And I really like that, because the dungeons are vital to getting caked up in the early game. Please put a stop to my misery. But it also gives you time to improve and refine your combat skills. Very nice. And it also allows you to find items to upgrade your weapon. Also very nice. The only systems that the game doesn't actually teach you about are Ashes of War and Spirit Summons, but I don't think they're actually necessary to warrant an in-game explanation, as they're quite simple, so the text-based explanation works great for it. After making it through all of that, you are presented with a boss which I am going to classify as the intended first boss. Margit is an incredible fight. From his beautiful design to the graceful golden hammer and sword. Okay, so this boss kicked my ass more times than I'm willing to admit, as he's incredibly punishing, which I actually quite like, because at the point that you're recommended to fight him, you are already used to the structure of boss fights and the combat. Margit is the first main story boss, but it also is the first major hurdle of the game, and it really gets you into the mindset of if you can beat him, then you can beat any of the other bosses, and it's really accurate. It really does remind me of Edix Gundyr from Dark Souls 3, which is a fight we'll get into in a bit, but Edix is a hard boss for anybody who plays that game because he is relentlessly aggressive but also balanced. But because he is one of the hardest bosses in the game, it means that you can break the old habits from the other games and get used to how the other fights will treat you. And this is exactly what Margit teaches the player. If you just spam dodge rolls and hope for the best, which is a trap many players would fall into, you'd be surprised, you will get heavily punished. But after you beat him, for one, you get that classic Dark Souls rush of adrenaline, but also you now have a strong chance of being able to walk over pretty much any of the other bosses, apart from Radahn. Fuck Radahn! All of my homies hate Radahn. I think the one thing that makes Elden Ring so accessible to new players is how much build variety it has, as it's so easy to get the build you want. The talismans have pretty much every single possible effect you could want for your builds, so with all of this in mind, Elden Ring is going straight in at 101. Sorry, I mean an A tier. I don't really have a segue for this one, but Bloodborne, the game that to my refusal to believe was released 7 years ago. Oh my god, I am getting old. What am I doing with my life? Bloodborne is chock full of examples of what brilliant game design actually is. So let's dig right into this. The game opens up with the usual dosage of cryptic exposition and holy mother of god, what in the fuck is that thing? After that nightmare-inducing tea-spilling abomination is gone, the player wakes up on a gurney in a random clinic that we definitely won't be returning to later. We leave the room, walk down the stairs, and stumble across this little fella. Oh hey little doggo. Ah! Welcome to the Hunter's Dream, the hub world of Blood. And this is one of the first major reasons I love this game, because without even being a minute in, we are already taught two very valuable lessons. One, you are going to die, like a lot. And two, the dream is the place you come to get stronger. And then when you return to the clinic, we realize that going to the dream to get buffed up, it makes the enemies that felt hard before now crumble beneath their new god. One other thing I would really like to note about the dream is that the classic Souls series notes on the floor that tell you the controls are scattered around here, which I'm going to say is a lesson in exploration. Don't question me, it's my video. The dream is also where you can choose your starting weapon, and what I really like here is that there is enough of a selection to give a good variety, but not too many that feels daunting, which is really nice. But anyways, where were we? Ah yeah, Central Yharnam. Central Yharnam is without a doubt the best intro level in the entire series. It is so delicately designed that it teaches you every single core mechanic of the game and gives you a challenging and fast-paced environment to help you get to grip on the combat. It's here where the game teaches you that you are not going to get an opportunity to attack unless you make one, and the odds are that you are gonna get hit quite a lot, but the fact that you keep attacking forces you to witness the most unique system in the game, the rally system, which gives you an opportunity to regain some health you lost, and the inclusion of hyper armor makes it even easier to do so. This area also teaches mega important lesson of exploring literally every single nook and cranny of the areas, because you will find shortcuts and even a few sneaky items which will give you an advantage in a specific boss fight. Speaking of boss fights, Father Gascoigne is the first proper fight in this game, and it's really a great way to kick off this incredible experience, because he embodies all the things that makes this game so different to those that came before it. Gascoigne is relentlessly aggressive, unforgivingly fast, and generally a really difficult fight. Even with that item that I spoke about earlier, which locks him in an animation for a few seconds, he still is an incredibly harsh boss. This fight, like Margit, will prepare you to die, but also prepare you for the rest of the game because of his first and third phase. In the first phase, you will get used to the hunter battles. This comes in handy because in later areas, these NPC battles are everywhere and they are really hard, so it's nice to have a heads up. And in his third phase, it gets you used to the more aggressive beast fights too. Central Yharnam is a masterclass in how a first level should be structured and designed. It does an immaculate job of introducing the core mechanics by having the player introduce it to themselves through their environment. It has two awesome bosses and sets the player up to enjoy the rest of this beautiful experience. And if you would like to see me gush more about this game, then go check out my video on it. The link will be in the description. But with all of this in mind, Bloodborne is going in God tier, baby. Woo! Woo! Now, for the moment I've been building this video up to from the thumbnail to this very moment, it's time to talk about our final entry. And that is, of course, Dark Souls 3. Oh, where to start? If you have been around this channel for a bit, then you will know that I absolutely adore Dark Souls 3. In my eyes, it's a gaming masterpiece, link in the description, and it deserves so much love and attention. But I'm not here to ramble on about my favorite games of all time. No, I'm here to deliver definitely unbiased and critical evaluation of these games, wink wink. So let's begin to deconstruct this legendary game. You start in the Cemetery of Ash, a rather dull and uninteresting place, but it's about to get a lot better. You are shown a few basic enemies and expected to fight. With most weapons, they will die in a few R1s, so nothing too challenging. The game feels like a complete cakewalk, doesn't it? You walk out of the graveyard into the first bonfire. Huh, strange placement, but I guess we have to introduce it early enough, so that's fine. Come over to this ledge, jump down, grab a Titanite shard, which is an upgrade material by the way, look below this ledge and realize, oh no, not an enemy, but fear not, the plunge attack is here. After that, you elegantly come down this side of the cliff and kill these two enemies. And ooh, shiny, some firebombs. Okay, bit of a strange place to put them, but I guess it's going to be useful later and it will demonstrate why you should explore the areas as much as possible. Okay, so we've covered exploration, basic combat, upgrade materials, plunge attacks. What are we missing again? Oh yeah, a boss fight. Oh, hello, conveniently placed statue that the game is telling me to remove a sword from. Ah! Edict Gundyr is an absolutely incredible introduction to this game, simply because he really embodies all of the core foundations that every single fight in this game's bosses follow. That is, that they're fast but have well telegraphed attacks, each boss has a specific rhythm to it, but once you get into the flow, so to speak, these bosses become a bit easier, but also more enjoyable. The last core principle is that each boss has two phases. Some completely shift the dynamic fight, but for others, for instance, Vort of the Boreal Valley, he just becomes more aggressive and a bit faster. But with Edicts, his second phase completely shifts how you approach the fight because of that thing. After defeating the Iron Giant from Wish, you can leave and head to the Firelink Shrine and find out that this is where you can teleport to the next level, and the first actual level, the High Wall of Lothric. High Wall is a decent first area. It gets you accustomed to a bunch of the enemies that you are going to find throughout the game and presents it in a fair challenge. This level gives you a lot of things to explore without feeling like you're going to get lost. It's also a really nice way of determining how much progress you're making by how far down you've gone. The verticality of this level is really nice, as there isn't really a time where you don't feel like you're making any progress. That mixed with the fact it isn't too long and has a really nice shortcut back to the first bonfire is a perfect first level for these games. It being fast-paced and aggressive also sets you up nicely for DS2, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, Demon Souls, and possibly Sekiro, but I haven't actually played that one, so tell me in the comments what you think. Despite the issues with Dark Souls 3, it really just is a more polished version of DS1, and the linearity makes the game feel not as daunting as the first, but still makes you feel like you're exploring a big world. But if you want to hear more about why I like this level design, then again, I will leave a link to my video on it in the description. And with that bit of shameless self-promotion, that is everything I wanted to talk about with Dark Souls 3. And it's going in God tier because how could I not? It really does deserve the rank because it's so incredible. So now we've ranked them all, which is the definitive answer to what the best Souls game to start with is? And well, honestly, it's any of them. Now, wait, before you pull the pitchforks out, let me explain. Every single Souls game does follow a very similar formula, and so it doesn't really matter which you start with. So just play the one that you feel interests you the most. But if I had to give a suggestion on where you should start, I would say that Bloodborne is a fantastic choice if you can access it. And bonus, if you have PS Plus, then it's free. But make sure you pick up the DLC because it makes the game even better. Again, go check out my video on that if you want to hear more about that. But other than that, I would say Dark Souls 3. It's a really beautiful example of what these games are at their core, just without the clunkiness that the previous titles had. So no matter what game you choose, just make sure you have fun with it. These games are phenomenal, and I really hope you love them just as much as I do. And on that sentimental note, it's time for me to ask you to please do consider subscribing, as I have planned to make more videos just like these, as this was really fun to make, and also it just really helps me out. And hey, maybe even consider dropping a like. But with that in mind, thank you again for watching, and good luck out there, Ashen One.